Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story number 1. I was staying at a cabin in Canada, nestled deep in a forest that seemed to sleep beneath a thick blanket of snow. It was a family-owned lodge, nothing fancy or extravagant, just a modest retreat built by my grandparents decades ago, kept in the family as a quiet getaway. Every now and then, someone from the family would retreat there, drawn by the silence, the isolation, and the purity of the wilderness. I'd gone just after the new year, seeking a few nights of solitude. The cabin was off-grid, reachable only by snowmobile during the colder months. It sat alone in the vast, frozen expanse like a time capsule of simpler days, a place where silence breathed and time slowed down. When I arrived, I fired up the old wood heater and unpacked my things. Within just 30 minutes, a quiet relief washed over me. The very feeling I'd been longing for. No noise, no phones, no clutter of thought. Just the deep hum of winter and the cracking of wood in the fire. That first night passed in perfect stillness. I rose early the next morning, the sky painted in soft pastels as the sun stretched over the snowy treetops. I made breakfast on top of the wood stove, its warmth soothing against the cold that seeped through the old timber walls. After eating, I bundled up and stepped outside to gather more firewood. But as I opened the front door, my body tensed. There, in the fresh snow leading up to the cabin, were footprints, human footprints. They stopped right at my door. No trail from the road, no snowmobile tracks, just a set of steps that ended abruptly at my front porch. I stepped out slowly, scanning the silent woods around me, trying to calm the rush of questions in my head. I followed the prints for a while, expecting to find signs of a vehicle or another path, but they led only deeper into the forest, veering away from the road, from civilization, from any rational explanation. How had someone gotten out here without a snowmobile? Why would they be here in the dead of night? I hadn't heard a thing during the night, which seemed impossible given how close the tracks came. I shook off the unease and continued gathering wood, reasoning that maybe it had just been someone passing through. Maybe they were lost. Maybe it was just a curious hunter who mistook the cabin for an empty outpost. And yet, despite my attempts to reason it away, I kept glancing out the windows, checking the tree line, listening for footsteps that never came. The hours passed slowly, the cabin now quieter in a way that felt unnatural, like the air itself had tensed up. I tried to distract myself, read a book by the fire, made tea, even jotted down a few lines in my journal, but my focus kept returning to those prints in the snow, those silent echoes of someone else's presence. As the temperature warmed slightly that afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. A part of me wanted to explore, but another part, a deeper, more unsettled part, wanted answers. So I bundled up again and followed the prints into the woods, this time determined to find their origin. The trail wound through the trees like a strange breadcrumb path, no diverging steps, just a single direction leading away from the cabin. I walked for 20 minutes, maybe more. Time moved strangely in that place. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional sigh of wind through the trees. I saw no cabins, no shelters, no sign of anyone having camped or rested here. Just snow, trees, and the quiet presence of something watching. Then, all at once, I heard it. A single, distinct crunch in the snow ahead of me. Not mine, someone else's. My breath caught. I whipped my head forward, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. But nothing moved. Nothing stirred. Stillness returned so abruptly it made me dizzy. But I knew what I had heard. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a footstep, close and deliberate. The kind of sound a person makes when they realize they're not alone and try to hide. Goosebumps rippled down my arms. My instincts took over. I called out, my voice quieter than I intended. "Hello? Is someone out there?" But there was no reply, not even the rustle of wind. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. The trees stood like quiet sentinels, watching but unmoved. Fear rose in my chest, not the kind that screams or panics, but the kind that whispers quietly and urgently. "Leave." I turned and began to walk back, forcing myself not to run, to pretend I was calm, in control. But the feeling of being followed clung to me like a shadow. I packed quickly when I returned to the cabin, every creak of the floorboards making me flinch. I locked the cabin, started the snowmobile and left, feeling like I was fleeing from something I couldn't name. As the cabin disappeared behind me, a dark corner of my mind asked, what would have happened if I hadn't heard that step? What if I'd stayed another night? I never went back after that. The cabin still sits there, waiting in the snow, unchanged and undisturbed. Or so I hope. The family still owns it, but none of us have visited since. We just stopped going. No one talks about it, but I know they feel it too. That sense that something once crossed into our sanctuary and never truly left. Sometimes when I lie awake at night, I picture those prints in the snow, the way they stopped so calmly at my door. And I wonder, was it curiosity, Alice? Or something older, something that had always lived in the woods and simply chose to be seen that night? There's a silence in snow-covered places that feels almost holy. But that day, it felt like a silence waiting to be broken. Like something had been watching and waiting for years and finally decided to reach out. Sometimes the woods are just woods, and sometimes they're not. I've told myself for years that it was probably just a lost hiker, someone drunk, confused, wandering aimlessly. But I know better. I know the way the air felt that day. I know the heaviness that clung to the trees, and the way my breath felt too loud in that endless quiet. I know what it means to be watched, and I know what it means to run. They say you're never truly alone in the wilderness. That animals, spirits, or memories of people long gone cling to these places. Maybe that's true. Or maybe something newer lives there now, something that learned how to move without being seen, how to reach cabins without leaving any sign but a quiet footstep and a vanishing trail. It chills me, still. The woods haven't changed, but I have, and no matter how far I go, I carry that moment with me, the moment I realized the snow wasn't as empty as it seemed. It had been walked on, watched from, and I was never meant to be there alone. Story number 2. Every year, toward the end of February, my good friend Justin and I had a tradition of heading out into the snowy wilderness for a camping trip. It wasn't anything extravagant, just the two of us, a tent or two, and a shared love for cold silence, the kind of silence you only find in a winter forest. We both had experience with backpacking, so the freezing temperatures didn't faze us much. In fact, there was something comforting about camping out beneath a sky of icy stars, with snow crunching beneath your boots and the slow flicker of firelight dancing in your eyes. We'd set up our little camp near a clearing, surrounded by tall pines, built a solid fire to keep warm, and settled in with a few drinks, just enjoying the stillness that the world rarely offered anymore. We hadn't been there long, maybe an hour, when the stillness broke. A scream, distant and hollow, cut across the forest like a jagged tear in fabric. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in a movie, or even from someone just being dramatic. This one was raw, like something pulled from a throat not used to yelling. It echoed over the snow, reverberating across the hills, and then it stopped. Just like that, silence returned too quickly, almost unnaturally so. Justin and I both jumped up from our chairs. We didn't even speak at first, just stared into the darkness in the direction it came from. Justin muttered that it might have been an animal, maybe a fox or something, mimicking a human voice. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself, not me. But deep down, we both felt that this was no animal. No creature we knew made sounds like that. Still, what could we do? We were miles from the nearest town, alone except for the stars and the fire. We stood near the flames for a while longer, eyes darting into the trees, waiting to hear it again, half hoping we wouldn't. After a while, we sat back down, trying to resume our evening. The sun had dipped beyond the trees, and the forest was cast in a deep navy blue, with the firelight the only thing warding off the cold that crept closer with every minute. We added more logs, made some food, and tried to laugh it off, but that tension lingered in the air like frost. We weren't quite ready to admit it, but something had shifted the moment we heard that scream. Something had opened, and it hadn't closed again. Then it returned. Another scream. This time, closer. Much closer. It was still distant enough not to be seen, but close enough to feel. The kind of scream you hear just before you're meant to see someone appear, staggering from the shadows. Justin and I locked eyes. We didn't even need to speak. We both grabbed our coats, and I took my knife. Not because we expected to use it, but because holding something sharp in your hand is a comfort in situations where you understand less than you fear. We made our way into the woods. Footsteps light, breathing held, ears open for anything out of place. The forest, which had once seemed peaceful, now felt like it was hiding things behind every tree. We walked about 150 feet in, moving toward where we thought the scream had come from, and then, suddenly, we heard it again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was just off to our side, no more than 20 feet away. Not a scream this time, a breath, a whisper of movement. I turned, scanning, but I saw nothing but shadows. Trees stood quietly, their bare branches clawing at the sky. I glanced at Justin, and his expression told me all I needed to know. He was just as terrified as I was. We waited, and waited, for minutes that felt like hours. Then Justin slowly stepped forward, and I followed. We hadn't gone far when he stopped so suddenly I nearly bumped into him. His hand went to my chest, holding me back. Then he pointed. Lying in the snow just ahead was the carcass of a deer. It wasn't frozen like most roadkill you'd find this time of year. It was fresh. The blood had only just begun to darken against the snow. But that wasn't what made us freeze. It was the fact that the deer's eyes were still open, and it had been dragged, not hunted. Tracks in the snow surrounded it. Not boot prints, but bare feet. And then, Justin tapped my shoulder again. Slowly, I looked up. Standing in the shadows across the clearing was a man, or what looked like a man. He was tall, thin, dressed in clothing far too light for winter. No coat, no gloves, just a shirt and pants. And he was watching us, not moving, not speaking, just watching. He didn't react like someone surprised to be seen. He stared as though we were the ones intruding, as if we had stepped into his space. We didn't wait. We didn't speak. We turned and began walking fast, then faster, back toward our camp. I could feel the weight of his gaze on our backs the whole way. When we reached the fire, we didn't stop to warm our hands or catch our breath. We packed everything, haphazardly, frantically. The tent was bundled with shaking hands, our bags crammed with half-frozen gear. Within minutes we were on our way, snow crunching underfoot as we left the clearing behind. That whole walk back to the car, I didn't look back once. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want to know if he was following. I just wanted to get out. We never spoke much about that night. Not really. We told ourselves stories, filled in the blanks. Maybe it was a hiker who'd gotten lost. Maybe he was living off the grid, trying to scare us away. But even as we said those things, we didn't believe them. There was something in his eyes, something that wasn't quite right, something that didn't belong to a normal person. Something patient and cold. We never returned to that camping spot. The forest hadn't changed, but our memories had, and that was enough. There are plenty of other woods to hike, other clearings to camp in. We never felt the need to go back. And sometimes I wonder if he's still there, still watching, still listening for people who don't belong. I think about that deer, how it had been placed there as if deliberately, as if it was a message or a warning. And I think about how the scream stopped the moment we got close, how he knew we were coming. I wonder how many others have passed through those woods. I wonder how many didn't make it back to their fires. The forest is vast, and snow covers everything eventually. But footprints don't disappear from your memory, and neither do eyes that never blink. Story number 3. It was the night before Christmas Eve, and I had just started my shift delivering for DoorDash, hoping the holiday rush would bring in a little extra money. The snow was falling lightly outside, and the streets were quieter than usual, coated in a soft white blanket that made everything feel calm, peaceful, almost dreamlike. Around 11:00 p.m, I received a delivery request, just a single bag of food, nothing out of the ordinary. Most of the deliveries that night had been grocery orders, likely because stores were about to close for the holiday and people were stocking up. This one stood out because of how far it was. The address was well beyond my usual delivery zone, but since requests were scarce and I wanted to make the most of the evening, I accepted the job without hesitation and made my way there through the snow-dusted roads. The GPS guided me far past the suburbs into a stretch of wooded back roads where the street lights grew sparse and the houses fewer and farther between. Eventually, the directions led me down what I assumed would be a residential neighborhood, but it turned out to be a narrow path flanked by trees. At the end of the path sat a small, rustic-looking cabin, almost hidden in the dark. Its porch light was dim and flickering, casting just enough glow to reveal a thin layer of snow covering the step. I parked my car carefully and stepped out, food bag in hand, making my way up to the door. The air felt unnaturally still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I knocked a few times and waited, expecting someone to answer quickly given how cold it was, but no one came right away. Instead, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. Laughter. Voices. A gathering of people inside, but there was something off about it. The sounds weren't quite right. I heard overlapping voices, the kind you might expect from a holiday party, but the tone didn't match the volume. The laughter was too cheerful, too rhythmic, like it was looping. It reminded me more of a recording than a real conversation. The cabin was small, certainly not big enough for the number of voices I was hearing. I leaned in slightly, trying to peer through the side window, but it was too fogged up from the warmth inside. Then the door opened. A man stood there, smiling at me with an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. The interior of the house behind him was dimly lit and completely still, with no sign of the lively crowd I'd just heard. The sounds were still playing, but they seemed to be coming from a back room, muffled and disjointed. There was no movement inside, no shadows shifting, no one milling about or passing by, just silence and that strange, artificial noise. "Why don't you bring the food inside?" the man said. "They'll be happy to see you." His voice was calm, almost too polite, and I found myself frozen, unsure of how to respond. It was such an odd thing to say. I stammered, trying to decline politely, but he cut me off. "They just want to thank you," he added, "for working during the holidays. You'll be glad you stopped by." As he spoke, the party chatter in the background seemed to grow louder, as if it was reacting to him, syncing with his words. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It just ended, as though someone had hit pause on a stereo. The carving was plunged into a thick silence, the kind that swallows you whole. The man hesitated. He looked over his shoulder toward the source of the sound, clearly not expecting it to cut out. That was all I needed. I dropped the food bag onto the porch and backed away, mumbling something about needing to go. I turned and walked briskly back to my car, not daring to look behind me. When I got in and locked the doors, my hands were shaking. I drove off quickly, my heart racing as I watched the cabin shrink in my rearview mirror, that dim porch light flickering like a dying star. I didn't take another delivery that night. I went straight home, locked the doors, and didn't open them again until Christmas morning. I kept trying to tell myself it was just a strange encounter, maybe someone playing a weird prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The memory of that place haunted me long after. It wasn't just the man's unsettling demeanor, or the eerie disconnect between what I heard and what I saw. It was the way everything seemed staged, like a performance that had been interrupted. I kept replaying the moment when the sound stopped, wondering if I had broken some kind of illusion. I thought about what would have happened if I'd stepped inside. Would the voices have started again? Would I have become part of whatever show they were running? Or worse, would the silence have remained, stretching on forever as I stood in that small, dimly lit cabin with someone or something that wore a human smile without understanding what it meant? I never reported the incident. I didn't even tell my family. What would I have said? That I heard a fate party and was invited into a haunted cabin? It sounded absurd, and yet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hallway behind the man. Saw the empty room where the party should have been. I began to wonder if there were others who had gone inside. Other drivers, people who didn't feel the hesitation I did. People who stepped over the threshold and never came out again. What if the cabin wasn't a home at all, but a trap? A place that lured the lonely with warmth and noise, and then swallowed them whole when they crossed the line. That night changed how I view isolation. Before then, I thought of remote cabins as peaceful, tranquil, a place to get away. But now, I see them differently. I think of what's hiding behind closed doors, what waits in silence, mimicking joy just enough to lure someone inside. I think of empty houses playing party sounds like bait. I think of the snow covering up footprints, and how many stories begin with a knock on a door that should have stayed closed. The holidays are a time for warmth, for gathering. But sometimes, the illusion of those things is used for far darker purposes, and I wonder if that man, the one who opened the door, even knew what was really inside. With him, I haven't taken a delivery in the woods since then. I stick to city streets, well-lit homes, familiar neighborhoods. And when I drop off a bag of food, I leave it on the step and walk away. I don't wait for doors to open. I don't listen for voices, and I never, ever go inside. There are things out there that know how to look like us, how to talk like us, how to wear the mask of human kindness, but they don't understand it. Not really. They mimic what they see, trying to learn. And when they do, they draw you in. All it takes is a little snow, a quiet road, and one strange invitation to step inside. Story number 4. It was the day after Christmas, and the streets still carried the quiet magic of the season. Faded twinkle lights, leftover snow in the corners of parking lots, and a stillness that only seemed to follow major holidays. I was working the overnight shift at a small family-owned grocery store, where I'd been employed for about a year. My job was simple: stock shelves, tidy up, and keep an eye on things while the rest of the world slept. I remember wondering why they'd even scheduled someone for that shift. The store had been closed on Christmas, and with low foot traffic during the holidays, there wasn't much that needed to be done. The shelves weren't exactly bare, but I didn't complain. I liked the silence, the routine, and the emptiness of the aisles echoing softly with my footsteps. It gave me time to think. The first hour passed uneventfully. I restocked some snacks, straightened a few items in the produce section, and walked the same slow circuit I always did. But as I moved past the large front windows, I saw something that made me pause. There was a man standing unusually close to the glass. Too close. Most late-night pedestrians pass by without a second glance. But this one was still watching me. He didn't knock. He didn't wave. He just stood there, unmoving, with his face half lit by the glow from the store's interior lights. I stared back for a few seconds, unsure what to do. Then, unnerved, I turned and walked toward the back of the store, pretending I hadn't seen him. I didn't want to escalate anything. Maybe he was just drunk or confused. Maybe he'd walk away. After a few minutes, I returned to the front, cautiously peeking out the window. He was gone. I sighed in relief, though the unease lingered. I brushed it off as a one-off experience, a strange but harmless moment. I resumed my routine, moving between aisles, organizing cans and refacing cereal boxes. It was during one of these passes, maybe 10 minutes later, when I rounded a corner and stopped abruptly. Several heavy boxes had fallen from a shelf, sprawled out across the floor, like someone had violently knocked them over. They weren't light, and they weren't stacked precariously. I stared at the scene, confused, and then I heard it. Laughter. A quiet, low laugh that didn't sound right. It came from the far end of the aisle, behind the next corner. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was strange, stilted. It sounded like a grown man imitating a child. A chill ran down my spine. I froze, listening. The laugh didn't continue. I debated going to check, to confront whoever it was, but the image of the man outside the window flashed through my mind. He was tall, broad, and could easily overpower me if he wanted to. I didn't know if it was him, but I didn't want to find out. My heart began to race. I turned and walked briskly to the front doors. Stepping out into the cold night air, I got into my car, locked the doors and called the police. I didn't even look back toward the store while I waited. The idea that someone was inside, hiding and watching me, made my skin crawl. Within 10 minutes, the police arrived, flashing lights breaking through the darkness as they stepped inside. When they emerged, their faces were grim. The man was gone. But the security footage told another story, one I wish I had never seen. The cameras showed him finding his way in through a rarely used side door that must have been left slightly ajar. He slipped inside quietly, avoiding the front aisles, and moved toward the shelves where I was working. The footage showed him crouched, waiting, eyes focused on me from behind displays, and in his hand, clearly visible, was a small blade, something like a switchblade or a folding knife. He watched me, followed me. He crept through the store, stalking like a predator in slow motion. The laugh I'd heard came right after I passed by. He had whispered it just loud enough to draw me in, like bait. The officers believed he was under the influence, and I agreed. But it didn't matter what state he was in. What mattered was that he had a weapon, and he was inside with me. That laugh, that slow reveal of his presence, it wasn't just intoxicated behavior. It was deliberate. It was a game. A performance meant to scare, confuse, and control. I realized, had I followed the sound, turned that corner just a little sooner, I might not be here retelling this. I might have walked straight into whatever he had planned. Instead, I had left. I'd trusted that uneasy feeling inside me, the same feeling that urged me to keep my distance from the man at the window. After that night, everything changed. I didn't quit the job right away, but I stopped taking overnight shifts. I couldn't walk through those dark aisles again without seeing his shadow hiding behind the shelves. I couldn't stand at the window without fearing another face silently watching me. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, of every door creak and every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I slipped. I no longer assumed I was alone just because I couldn't see anyone. I realized that sometimes people hide in the places we feel safest. They study our habits. They wait for the quietest moment. Even now, years later, I check every lock twice. I never assume a door is closed unless I close it myself. That night could have ended differently. A second later, a different decision, a misplaced step, and I would have never walked out of that store. I think about that often, how fate, instinct, or whatever force you believe in sometimes nudges you to run, to retreat, to survive. I'll never know why he chose that store or why he wanted to harm someone, but I do know he was watching and he had planned it. That's what makes it all the more chilling. Not randomness, but intent. I've learned that monsters don't always appear with a roar or a scream. Sometimes they come quietly, with a smile pressed against a window, or a giggle echoing from the end of an aisle. They lurk in the cracks of ordinary nights, waiting for a moment when no one is looking. I got lucky. Others might not. So when your instincts whisper, even softly, listen. Trust the fear that doesn't make sense, because it might be the only thing keeping you alive in the dark. Story number 5. It was New Year's Eve, and like most years, I found myself caught in a tug-of-war between wanting to stay home in the quiet comfort of my room and feeling pressure to attend the festivities that others found exciting. I was never much of a party person. I preferred calm moments, stillness and solitude. But this year, a good friend of mine insisted. He was throwing a New Year's bash at his house, a large place on a stretch of land outside of town. He was known among our group as the rich friend, the one with the driveway long enough to feel like a road and a house big enough to get lost in. My buddy Trav picked me up around 9 p.m, and soon we were in the thick of it. Music playing, people laughing, drinks pouring. There must have been 30 people there. Not too chaotic, but just enough for me to feel like an outsider among the noise. The night unfolded as expected. Drinking games, loud music, countdowns and laughter. I let myself go a little, drinking more than I normally would, letting the buzz dull my resistance. When the clock struck midnight, we all cheered and clinked glasses, hugging and shouting over the sound of fireworks in the distance. I smiled, laughed and pretended I was having the time of my life. But as the hours passed, my energy began to fade. Around 3 a.m, I knew I was ready to leave. I searched for Trav, only to find him passed out upstairs on a bed, shoes still on, completely unreachable. No one else seemed sober enough to drive, so I made my way outside and did the responsible thing, ordered an Uber. The house was far from any main roads and the cold air outside was biting. I curled up on the curb at the end of the driveway, wrapping my coat tighter around me as I waited. The stars were beautiful that night, clear, endless. I remember thinking how nice it was to have a moment of quiet after all that noise. According to my phone, the driver was 10 minutes away. I glanced at the time, then rested my eyes for what felt like just a couple of minutes. But before I knew it, headlights swept across the driveway and a car pulled up. A man rolled down the window. "Uber?" he asked with a casual smile. I nodded, got up and climbed into the back seat, still groggy from drink and cold. It didn't occur to me then how quickly the car had arrived, or that the app hadn't sent a notification. The driver looked to be in his 50s, short dark hair, thick beard, and a face that seemed friendly enough. "Big party tonight?" he asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. I muttered something in agreement, not really in the mood for conversation, but the way he looked at me made me shift in my seat. His eyes lingered too long, his tone too rehearsed, too smooth. I told myself I was just being paranoid, still foggy from alcohol. I leaned back and closed my eyes, hoping to pass the time in silence. But just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I opened my eyes and instinctively glanced at the mirror again. He was already looking at me. Trying not to panic, I reached for my phone. My stomach dropped when I read the screen. A message from Uber said, "Your driver has arrived." And then another, from the actual driver, asking where I was. I looked back at the mirror. The man's eyes were still locked on mine. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. I was in the wrong car. This wasn't my Uber. And the man knew it. I could feel it in the air, in the stillness of his body, in the way he wasn't asking for directions or confirming the ride. He was just driving, calm and focused. I didn't say anything. I didn't move suddenly. I just leaned back and closed my eyes again, heart thudding in my chest, hoping to mask the fear rising inside me. About 30 seconds later, the car slowed to a stop at a red light. I took my chance. I pulled the door handle and jumped out while the car was still idling. He must have realized too late, because as I hit the pavement, the car lurched forward and I stumbled, scraping my hands on the asphalt. But I got up, heart racing, and ran. I didn't stop until I was around the corner, ducking behind a fence and calling 911 with shaking fingers. The operator stayed on the line with me until officers arrived. I never saw that car again. The real Uber showed up 5 minutes later, confused and apologetic. I explained everything to the police, but there was little they could do without a plate number or description beyond the man's face. And even that felt like it was fading from my mind by the minute. In the days that followed, I tried to wrap my head around what happened. Who was he? Was he just someone taking advantage of drunk partygoers waiting alone? Had he been driving around looking for victims? The thought made me sick. The realization that I could have disappeared that night without a trace haunted me. No one would have known. Everyone was drunk, asleep, or distracted. If I hadn't checked my phone, if I dozed off, if I hadn't jumped out when I did, the outcome might have been terrifyingly different. It wasn't just a close call. It was a moment that split reality into two paths, one where I escaped and one where I didn't. Since that night, I've been different. More alert, more suspicious. I double-check everything, every ride, every driver. I never assume. I never let my guard down, even for a second. I've learned that danger doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, a warm voice, a car that feels like it belongs. It preys on tired minds and quiet nights. And if you aren't paying attention, it can take everything. People assume they'll feel it when something is wrong, that their instincts will scream, but sometimes the danger is subtle. It waits for you to ignore it, to doubt yourself. I'm just lucky mine spoke up in time. New Year's Eve is supposed to be a celebration, a rebirth, a fresh start. But for me, it became something else entirely. A reminder, a cautionary tale. Every year now, when the clock strikes midnight and fireworks light up the sky, I don't cheer. I breathe deeply, silently. I think of that night and how close I came to vanishing. And I remind myself, not all monsters hide in the dark. Some pull up in a quiet car, call your name and wait for you to get it. Story number 6. Day off. It was the first weekend of February, and I was enjoying some rare time off from work, just relaxing at home. The snow outside had fallen heavily the night before, and everything looked bright and silent, like the entire world had been dipped in powdered sugar. I had no plans that day. It was just one of those calm weekends, when you let time stretch out with no purpose. I spent most of the morning in my pajamas, moving slowly between the kitchen, the living room, and my favorite armchair, not really doing much of anything. It was around midday when I heard a thud upstairs. Not a loud one, just one single sound, dull and distant, like something had fallen or maybe been moved. I paused, listening for anything else, but when nothing followed, I shrugged it off. I figured it might have been something shifting in the attic, or a gust of wind pushing against the roof. After all, it was an old house, and old houses have a way of speaking in creaks and groans. The rest of the day passed without much thought given to the noise. I forgot about it almost completely. Evening rolled in slowly, and as the sky darkened, I found myself curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over me and a movie playing in the background. I must have been halfway between asleep and awake when it happened again. A thud, same as before. Not sharp or alarming, but unmistakably present. I sat up slowly, trying to shake the grogginess from my head. This time I felt a trace of unease. I turned off the movie and walked upstairs, trying to follow the sound to its source. My bedroom was empty. I checked the hallway, then the spare bedroom, which I rarely used. The door creaked softly as I opened it, revealing a quiet, empty space. Everything seemed in order. Still, something about the air felt wrong, heavier somehow, as if the house itself was holding a secret. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe the heater settling, maybe an animal on the roof. But deep down, I knew better. The way the sound had repeated, the identical rhythm of both thuds, made it feel intentional. Still, I brushed it off and went to bed. Sleep came, but it was restless. I kept waking up every hour, straining to hear something, anything, but the house was silent. The next morning, I went about my routine as usual. I made coffee, stepped into the kitchen and noticed something small but strange. The cereal boxes in the pantry were moved. The chips were slightly shifted from where I remembered placing them. It wasn't something most people would notice, but I'm the kind of person who remembers little details. The bag I opened the day before was now sealed shut. I stood there for a long moment, wondering if I had misremembered. Surely I had. But the longer I stared, the more it felt wrong. I tried to dismiss it again. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd sleepwalked. I told myself whatever explanation I needed to carry on with my day. But my mind wouldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention, watching the house, testing doors and light switches, checking the locks. Everything seemed fine. Still, by late afternoon, the tension had returned, wrapping around my chest like an invisible cord. I tried distracting myself with chores, with cleaning, with folding laundry. The sun set quietly, casting soft shadows across the walls. I was heading toward the stairs to go check on things one last time when I heard it again. Another thud. This time, closer. And with it, a click. A faint but unmistakable click, like a door latch or a lock turning from the other side. I froze halfway up the steps. My eyes slowly turned toward the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. I approached slowly, heartbeat thudding in my ears louder than the sound I had just heard. I reached for the handle. It stopped halfway. The door was locked from the inside. My blood ran cold. There was no reason for that door to be locked. I never used that room. I stumbled back, my legs weak, hands trembling. A second later I heard it. Movement from behind the door, soft but unmistakable. Someone was in there. I didn't wait to find out more. I bolted down the stairs, grabbed my phone, and rushed outside into the cold night air. I ran to the end of the street, shivering, breath coming out in rapid puffs as I called 911. The police arrived quickly. I watched from a distance as they entered the house, guns drawn. Minutes passed like hours. When they came out, their expressions were grim. The house was empty, at least, almost. Inside the closet of the spare bedroom, they found evidence that someone had been living there. Grocery bags, a few food wrappers, a small crumpled blanket. They told me whoever had been there must have entered the house days earlier, quietly enough for me not to notice. They were likely coming out at night, rummaging through the pantry while I slept, staying silent during the day, just existing inside the walls of my life like a shadow I had never noticed. The thought made my skin crawl. They never found the person. No fingerprints, no real leads, just the evidence and the lingering discomfort. I changed the locks the next day, bought a security system, started sleeping with the light on. But even with all those changes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had shared my space with a stranger, that I had slept while someone was walking just feet away, that every time I watched a movie or made breakfast, someone might have been listening from behind a door. It changes you. That kind of intrusion leaves a mark that no alarm system can erase. To this day, I still hear things in the house, small things, the faint tap of a cabinet, a rustle, a creak that feels too purposeful. Maybe it's paranoia, maybe it's just the way trauma echoes inside quiet walls. But part of me still wonders, what if they never really left? What if they come back? What if right now they're just waiting for me to forget again? And that's what truly terrifies me. Not the presence itself, but the silence that lets it in. Story number 7. It was the middle of January, a time when even the most familiar places begin to feel foreign beneath layers of snow and silence. I had just moved into a new apartment, an older unit in a modest building tucked away on the quieter side of town. The rent was low and the location was ideal, close to work, close to stores, and far enough from the main road to keep things peaceful. The building itself had an aged charm, creaky wooden floors, antique fixtures, and radiators that hissed and clanged when the heat kicked in. I didn't mind. In fact, I kind of liked it. There was something comforting about the imperfections, something that made the space feel lived in, even if I was now its only occupant. Also, I thought, my first few nights were uneventful. I spent the evenings unpacking, setting up furniture, getting used to the way the old pipes groaned when the water ran. It was around the 5th night that I noticed something strange. It was subtle at first, a faint tapping sound behind the walls. Not the random ticking of an old building, but something rhythmic, consistent. Always the same number of taps, always in the same spot, just behind the wall near my bedroom closet. I thought maybe it was the heating system, or some quirk in the building's structure. I mentioned it to the landlord when I saw him the next day, and he waved it off. "Just old bones," he said, smiling. "This place creaks like a ghost, but it's harmless." I laughed with him, though something inside me didn't feel like laughing. The tapping continued every night, always just after I turned out the lights. 5 taps, always 5. It became something I started to expect, like a twisted bedtime routine. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the echo of something mechanical. But the consistency was too perfect. Same timing, same location. One night I decided to investigate. I tapped back. 5 slow knocks on the wall. I waited, half hoping for nothing to happen, but within seconds, I got a reply. 5 taps, echoing mine, my breath caught in my throat. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to reason through what had just happened. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone on the other side of the wall had heard me and decided to play along. But the wall I had tapped on didn't share a partition with another apartment. On the other side of that wall was just a narrow maintenance crawl space, one I'd been told was sealed shut years ago. I barely slept that night. Every little sound set me on edge. I began to hear other things too, soft rustling like clothing brushing against wood, or the faint scrape of something being dragged. Each time I tried to explain it away, but the list of explanations was growing thin. A few days later I finally worked up the nerve to open the closet and inspect the wall. The plaster was old and cracked in places, but otherwise solid still. Something compelled me to knock again. 5 taps, and like clockwork, the reply came. 5 knocks from inside the wall. But this time, something else happened. I heard a whisper, just a word, barely audible but unmistakable. Soon. I stumbled back, heart racing, stumbling out of the closet and slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't open it again for 3 days. I called the landlord again, told him what I heard, and asked if anyone else had ever complained about the unit. He brushed it off again. "You've just got winter fever," he said. "The cold messes with your head. Don't worry about it." I could tell he didn't believe me. Or worse, maybe he knew something and didn't want to talk about it. That night, the tapping didn't come. For the first time in days, the apartment was completely quiet, and that silence was worse than the sound. It felt unnatural, too deliberate, as if something was holding its breath, waiting for me to relax. I stayed awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, flinching at every creak. When I finally dozed off near dawn, I dreamed of a man standing in the crawl space, face pressed against the wall, tapping patiently with long, broken fingers. The next day, I left work early and bought a stud finder and a flashlight. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was behind that wall. I returned home and moved everything out of the closet, pressing the scanner against the plaster. To my surprise, it beeped erratically. No clear studs, no consistent density. Just scattered readings as if something irregular lay behind it. I found an old panel near the base of the wall, probably once used for electrical access. I pried it open and peered inside. The crawl space was there, just as described, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and completely dark. But I saw something that made my blood run cold. A blanket. Old, filthy, crumpled on the floor just a few feet inside. Next to it was a tin can and a small notebook. Someone had been living there. I didn't go in. I closed the panel and called the police. When they arrived and searched the crawl space, they found signs of habitation. Scratched floorboards, old wrappers, fragments of food, but no one was there. Whoever it was had left, and from the cold in the space, they'd been gone at least a day or two. The notebook had sketches inside, dozens of them, all of the same room, my bedroom. Same bed, same furniture. The angles varied, but they were always from slightly above, as if drawn from vents or ceiling corners. The final page was different. It was a detailed sketch of me lying in bed, eyes closed. The timestamp at the bottom, written in smeared pencil, matched the exact night I had heard the whisper. I moved out the next day, packed only what I could carry and left the rest behind. The landlord didn't argue. I think he knew. Maybe others had left too. Maybe I was just one in a long line of tenants who'd heard the tapping and ignored their instincts. I never looked back. But to this day, when I lie in bed in a new apartment in a different town, I sometimes hear things at night. The soft thud of movement in walls, the faint click of something closing, and once, just once, 5 soft knocks, followed by a whisper I tried not to understand. Story number 8. Years ago, I took a seasonal job as a delivery driver in a rural mountain town known more for its snowfall than its population. The pay was modest, but I enjoyed the solitude that came with driving alone for hours, winding through forest-lined roads and snowy hills. I was assigned a delivery route that reached some of the most remote corners of the area, farms hidden by pine trees, cabins tucked behind unplowed roads, places where the silence stretched out so far it began to. Most people were kind, offering a smile and a nod before retreating indoors. But one location always gave me pause. A crooked house near the edge of town that looked like it had been forgotten by time and remembered only by the wind. The first time I delivered there, I noticed something strange. The house was barely standing, its shutters hanging crookedly, roof sagging with age and neglect. Yet the order form was neat and current, requesting fresh groceries and dry goods weekly. I knocked on the door. No answer. I rang the small rusted bell. Still nothing. But when I turned to leave, the door creaked open just a few inches. A pale hand reached out from the dark, took the bag gently, and closed the door again without a single word. I stood there, stunned. No face, no voice, just that silent exchange. I figured maybe the person inside was elderly or shy, someone who preferred privacy. That explanation worked well enough, and I moved on. Week after week, The routine repeated. I'd drop off the supplies, knock, wait, and eventually the hand would appear. Every time, the same pale, thin fingers, no greetings, no eye contact. Just that silent, careful retrieval of the groceries into the house's shadowed interior. The only sounds were the creaking of the door and the soft crunch of snow under my boots. It started to unsettle me after a while. I couldn't tell you exactly why. Nothing overtly wrong had happened, but something about the house felt frozen in time, not just in structure, but in spirit, as if it didn't belong to this timeline anymore, but some leftover thread from a forgotten past that hadn't fully let go. One day, my curiosity got the better of me. I brought the bag to the doorstep as usual, but instead of knocking and retreating, I stood still after my knock, watching the crack of darkness behind the barely open door. The hand emerged as always, but this time it hesitated. It lingered in the air just an inch longer than usual, fingers outstretched but unmoving, as if testing me. Slowly, I crouched down a little and tried to get a glimpse beyond the sliver of space that I saw made my blood run cold. There was no body behind the hand. It wasn't attached to anything, just a hand, floating in the darkness, perfectly steady, perfectly still. I stumbled back, heart pounding, the breath catching in my chest. The hand retreated, the door closed without a sound, and I stood in the snow not knowing whether to run or cry or scream. I drove off that day without completing the rest of my deliveries. I didn't report it. Who would believe me? I didn't want to lose my job, and I convinced myself it had to have been a trick of the light, a shadow playing games with my tired mind. But deep down, I knew. The image had seared itself into my brain. That hand didn't belong to a living person. There was no arm, no shoulder, just a hovering, impossibly steady hand that had been opening that door for weeks. I considered quitting the job, but something in me refused to give it up just yet. Maybe it was pride, maybe I wanted answers. I went back the following week, nerves tight in my chest, but this time the house was different. The door was wide open. No hand, no shadows, just the dim interior of the house staring back at me like an open wound. Against every instinct in my body, I stepped inside. The air was freezing, far colder than outside. Dust clung to the walls and the floor groaned beneath my steps. The house looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there in decades. Furniture covered in sheets, photographs turned to face the wall, mirrors veiled in cloth. In the kitchen, the groceries I had delivered over the past month were still there, unopened, untouched. They sat on the counter as if no one had ever moved them, cans unopened, bread still sealed. No signs of life at all. I turned to leave, heart pounding when I heard it. A whisper, so soft it almost wasn't sound. "Thank you." I froze, every hair on my body rising. It came again, from just behind me, closer now. "Thank you for remembering." I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the hallway stretching into the dark. I left the house without looking back, my breath shaking in the cold air, the door slowly creaking shut behind me, as if pushed by unseen hands. I never went back. I told my supervisor I couldn't deliver to that house anymore. He nodded, not even asking why, just made a note and reassigned the address. I found out a few months later that no one had lived in that house since the late 80s. The woman who'd owned it had died alone during a particularly brutal winter, her body undiscovered for weeks. The town had simply forgotten the house was even still listed. There were no current utility bills, no postal records, nothing. And yet, someone or something had been placing weekly orders through the delivery app. The trail ended there. No billing info, no phone number, just an empty request with perfect timing. I don't tell this story often. People laugh. They say I must have been tired, stressed, making things up in my head. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. That house wanted to be remembered. And I think, for a short while, I was its last visitor. Its final tether to the world it once belonged to. Some places aren't haunted, in the usual sense. They don't rattle chains or slam doors. Some places simply refuse to be forgotten. They call out in small ways, through flickering lights, through soft knocks, or even through a hand that reaches out just long enough to make you question everything you know about what's real. Story number 9. Back when I was in college, I spent my winter break working a security job for extra cash. It wasn't glamorous. Just a seasonal gig patrolling a commercial complex that included some warehouses and vacant offices. Most of the buildings were closed at night, especially during the holidays, so my job mostly consisted of walking loops around the lot, checking doors, and logging each pass in a little clipboard. It was easy money. Cold, yes, but I didn't mind the silence. There was something peaceful about walking through snow-covered pavement, under the amber glow of parking lot lights. My footsteps the only sound for miles. The shifts were long and quiet, and I was usually alone, except for the occasional visit from a supervisor. That solitude, once comforting, became something else the night I met the man in the stairwell. The building in question had 3 floors, an old concrete office block mostly cleared out for renovation. One wing was being remodeled, and the rest was locked down. On that particular night, I remember it being colder than usual, with the kind of wind that cuts right through your coat. I made my rounds as usual, stopping to warm up inside the lobby now and then. Around 2:00 a.m., I was doing an interior sweep when I decided to check the stairwell, just one of those routine things. The stairwells were rarely used. Most were locked or cluttered with construction gear, but this one was surprisingly clean, and the door swung open easily. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the difference in temperature. It was colder than outside, as if the stairwell had no insulation at all. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the grey concrete steps, and I began to descend. As I moved down to the second floor landing, I heard something that made me stop. A breath. Not mine. Not a breeze, but a slow, human exhale coming from just below. I froze, light trembling slightly in my hand. I called out, trying to keep my voice firm. "Security, anyone down there?" No response, just silence. I moved carefully to the next floor and swept the beam around. That's when I saw him. A man standing halfway down to the basement level, turned away from me. He wasn't wearing a coat, just a white button-up shirt and dark pants, completely still despite the cold. I called out again, louder this time. "Sir, you're not supposed to be here." He didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't move at all, just stood there, like he was listening to something only he could hear. I radioed it in to my supervisor, who said he'd head over to assist. In the meantime, I was told not to approach, just keep eyes on the person and wait. But that was easier said than done, because the man slowly turned, and what I saw made my skin crawl. His face was wrong, pale and stretched too tight, like skin over bone. But it wasn't the shape that unsettled me, it was his expression. He looked directly at me and smiled, but the smile didn't carry any emotion. It was too wide, too fixed, as if someone had instructed him on what a human smile was supposed to look like, and he was trying to imitate it. His eyes didn't match the grin. They were glassy, distant, like they were looking past me rather than at me. I backed up slowly, hands still on the radio, trying not to break eye contact. He didn't follow. Didn't move at all. Just kept smiling with that inhuman stillness. When my supervisor finally arrived 10 minutes later, we returned to the stairwell together, but the man was gone. We checked every level, every room, even the maintenance corridors. Nothing. The security footage from the cameras in the lobby and stairwells didn't show anyone entering or exiting, just me. Alone. I could see myself on the screen, walking through the stairwell with my flashlight. But no one was there in the footage. Not behind me, not in front of me. No trace of the man at all. I should have quit right then and there. But something about it didn't feel threatening. It felt like an encounter, like being witnessed rather than being in danger. Still, I requested to be transferred to daytime hours. I didn't go back to that building again. The other guards joked about it when they heard. Some said it was a squatter. Others claimed it was just sleep deprivation, but one older guard pulled me aside and said quietly, "You saw it, didn't you?" The mimic. I laughed nervously, not sure what he meant. But he didn't smile. He said, "There's something in that building that wears people's faces. It learns them, tries them on like clothes. It doesn't mean harm, it's just curious." I didn't know what to make of that. It sounded ridiculous, but part of me believed him. Because I remembered how that man had smiled, like someone trying to perform being human. I started researching after that. Found stories online about buildings where workers would encounter people who weren't there. Janitors who'd wave to someone and find out later no one else had been scheduled to work. Tenants who'd speak to someone in the elevator, only to learn that person had died years ago, all with that same description. Off. Slightly wrong. Close enough to pass at a glance, but uncanny the longer you looked. Like a reflection in a funhouse mirror that moves just a little too slow. Eventually the job ended and I moved on. But I never forgot the stairwell, or the man who smiled like he had just learned how. Now, whenever I enter a building late at night, especially the empty ones, I find myself glancing toward the corners of staircases, listening for breaths that don't belong. And every once in a while, I swear I hear them. Not close, just faint, lingering in the air, waiting patiently. I think some places absorb what we leave behind, and others try to become it.